Okay, so take a look at this tweet. It's from Refuge, which is a feminist organization in the UK. Shout out to Coyle Neal for calling for a gendered definition of domestic abuse. This is a gendered issue and a gendered crime. Hashtag domestic abuse bill. Okay, so this tweet is in reference to a domestic abuse bill that has been talked about in the UK government for about a year now. And as you can see in the title, feminists in the UK are fighting to legalize domestic violence against men. Now, I know people are probably saying, oh, that's just a clickbait title, or I'm sure it's not really like that, or I'm just exaggerating. But I'm going to show you why. In effect, that's actually what they're doing. And if they're successful in making the bill the way they want to, that's exactly what would happen. Now, this is the bill, the Domestic Abuse Bill 2020. I put a link down in the description below, along with everything else you see in this video. Now, as you'll see, the original bill was intended to protect everybody and basically just apply to everybody. It was a domestic abuse bill, and it was to protect victims of domestic abuse. But feminists protested because they didn't like the fact that men were included too. They weren't protesting to get extra protection for women, because women already had 100% protection under the bill. The only problem they had about the gendered language was that men were included, and they wanted to be changed so that men do not have legal protection under the bill. Okay, so this is an article from last year when the bill was first being proposed. You can see the headline: Domestic Abuse Bill Condemned for Ignoring Gendered Nature of Violence Amid Austerity Cuts. And the first paragraph: the government's new domestic abuse bill has been roundly condemned by campaigners for not recognizing the gendered nature of domestic violence. Now, let's see exactly what feminists mean by that. Adina Clare of Women's Aid, which is a feminist group, called for the landmark legislation to recognize the gendered element of domestic abuse in law, and noted the demand gained the backing of the parliamentary committee which formally reviewed the bill earlier this year. This was her quote: "Women are more likely to have sustained physical or emotional abuse or violence which results in serious injury or death," she said. "Violence against women is rooted in gender inequality. It is essential that this is explicitly recognized in the domestic abuse bill. To solve any complex social problem, we have to start by defining it, and we know that a gender-neutral definition does not work for this highly gendered issue." So, think about what that means. A gendered definition doesn't work, and she wants that explicitly stated in the law, which means men would not be included in the law. And the effect of that would mean domestic violence against men is not legally considered a crime, because the definition literally does not apply to men, because it's gendered. Now, I know feminists would say, oh, but it's not about legalizing it against men. It's just about making it gendered for women. But the effect of that is going to be legalizing it against men, because domestic violence against men, again, would not be a crime, because the definition of domestic violence is explicitly written a certain way, not to include men. And the reasoning for this is that, well, men are less likely to be victims. But why is that a reason not to include them? Even if there are less male victims, why shouldn't they have protection under law? How does it hurt women to include men too? That just doesn't make any sense. You wouldn't do that the other way around. If there was something where most of the people who were affected were men, let's say something like workplace fatalities, where the vast majority of people who die at work are men, you wouldn't say, oh, well, the law for workplace compensation for injury or death should only apply to male workers because there's more of them. And we're not going to include women because they're less likely to be injured or killed at work. That just wouldn't make any sense. your laws should protect workers. So your domestic violence laws should protect everybody affected by domestic violence. Let's look at another quote from a feminist. Sarah Green, co-director of End Violence Against Women Coalition, echoed her views and argued failing to recognize the gendered nature of the crime would have troubling real-world consequences. She added, teachers, police officers, and social workers will be given training with a non-gendered definition. It will, therefore, be more difficult for them to spot signs of domestic abuse. If you preach that it happens to men and women equally, you will not be able to understand the gender stereotyping and sexism element. But she talks about gender stereotypes, but what she's doing is literally perpetuating gender stereotypes, because she's perpetuating the stereotype that men can't be victims. She's literally encouraging that very stereotype. So when feminists say that they're against harmful gender roles, shouldn't that mean that they recognize that men can also be victims? Isn't it kind of like encouraging gender roles and being rigid in gender roles to say that men can't be victims? And it's pretty scary to think that teachers and police officers should not be trained that men can be victims too, or boys can be victims too. So what feminists want is for teachers and police officers to be taught that men and boys cannot be victims. So if a 15-year-old boy goes to his teacher and tries saying that he's in an abusive relationship, he's just ignored. Or if a man is being abused or physically injured and he calls the police, nothing can happen. Or he gets arrested. Because again, if feminists are successful in making this law gendered, it would be just that. It would be a gendered law, which means it only applies to one gender, which means domestic violence against men wouldn't be illegal, which of course in practice is the same thing as domestic violence against men being legal. Now of course, feminists will say that's not what we're trying to do, but if they're successful, that is what would happen in practice. That would be the result. And when she said teaching a gender-neutral definition would make it more difficult to spot victims of domestic abuse, if you teach a gendered definition of domestic violence, it makes it impossible to spot male victims of domestic abuse. So when MRAs say that feminism hurts men, and feminism isn't enough to help men, and feminism doesn't address men's issues, this is an example of what we're talking about. And this is an example of why we need the men's rights movement. Now, just a reminder, the article is from last year, but you'll see this tweet is from April 28th, 2020. So this debate is actually ongoing right now. It's been going on for a year, but this is still happening today.